If you were to list poor design decisions, from the ones that annoy me most, such as placing checkpoints before lines of dialogue, to milder bugbears like waffling intro cutscenes, then QuickTime events probably sit somewhere in the middle. Yet they've been creeping up the list over the last couple of years, since QTEs have become increasingly prevalent. Just a few examples from last year that have used and abused QTEs include Dead Space 2, Bulletstorm, Crysis 2, Battlefield 3, Modern Warfare 3, and Dead Island. So what is it about QTEs that developers are so keen on exploiting, and what makes them such a pain in the arse for us players? The answer to the first question is straightforward. A QTE allows the developer to wrench the action into cutscene territory, which ensures that the player won't miss whatever explosion or animation the expensive technology, whether it's the CryEngine 3 or the Frostbite engine, is powering. By reducing player input to 1 or 2 button pushes, the action no longer has to be programmed in real time, and the developers can craft a tightly directed action sequence without wresting all control from the player. It helps the game feel cinematic without having to resort to cinema. Sounds like a good compromise, right? Well, not exactly. The first major problem with QTEs are that they create an instantaneous rift between the player and the protagonist. This might not be an issue where QTEs are used sparingly and worked into the flow of play, but when a lengthy sequence of QTEs occur, the protagonist begins performing actions that simply don't correlate to the input required of the player. Let's look at a specific example. In Battlefield 3, one section requires the player character to disarm a bomb, and while doing so is interrupted by one of the antagonists and begins to brawl with him. This could have played out as an intense gameplay sequence. There's a long history of hacking minigames that developers could have drawn upon to get players involved with the disarming of the bomb. Then, when interrupted by the attacker, the player could have engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a system similar to Condemned or Escape from Butcher Bay, with the timer ticking away in the background. Once the attacker has been dealt with, the player rushes back to the bomb, recommences the disarming minigame, and defuses the device with seconds to spare. I don't see why that wouldn't have worked, and worked a hell of a lot better than what the player is actually given to work with. One press of the action button, and a few moments later, one press of the right trigger. Developer DICE shouldn't have even bothered with that if they were so keen on having that scripted moment. At least the player could sit back and munch a handful of crisps or something while the game goes ahead and has all of the fun for them. Another problem with QTEs is an aesthetic one. By their nature, they have to disrupt the user interface. Games generally teach player control input incrementally through discrete tutorial screens near the beginning of the game. After a couple of tries, the player knows that, for example, clicking in the left stick will make the character crouch, and so there's no need to be continually reminded later on. Yet since QTEs follow the chaotic rule that a random button will do something, the controls to navigate that rapidly occurring something, an event happening in QuickTime, if you will, has to be conveyed to the player like a roundhouse punch to the face. The way gaudy symbols flash up in the middle of the screen is counterintuitive to immersion. It reminds the player that they aren't hanging onto the edge of a precipice for dear life or jumping from an exploding tower, but manipulating a piece of plastic in front of a screen. Slapping a garish Bop-It-style button prompt in the middle of your mise-en-scène will only undo all of your hard effort gone into making a coherent art style. Now, I know QTEs aren't inherently evil. When used responsibly, they could create dramatic moments, such as Modern Warfare 2's final confrontation or Heavy Rain's finger-chopping scene, that would have been awkward to pull off with the game's conventional control scheme. However, what I object to most strongly in badly thought-out QTEs is their betrayal of a lack of faith in the player. What 90% of QTEs say to me as a player is,
"We don't trust you with full control over this bit of the game. We've spent thousands of pounds on these animations, on this soundtrack, on scripting these movements to the finest detail. You're only going to mess it up. Look, you can take part in this bit here, if you really must. Don't get it wrong, for Christ's sake."
That isn't a game. That isn't even an interactive movie. It's a bad movie you can poke at as and when the director tells you to. What little novelty QuickTime events once had has long since worn off. So developers who continue to use them to cover for lazy design should press X to reconsider, then B then A, then B, then X. Ah, you missed it.